Welcome to another episode of PG Radio. On this episode of my podcast, I have Patricia and Maz. Just to give a slight introduction, you're the co-founder of
Holding Space
Films and the co-creators of the Rise of Jordan Peterson, the recent film that was launched. When did you guys launch this film?
The premiere was September 26th.
September 26th. And also I'm joined by the founder president of Colloquia, the very own Perry Sidhu. And we are hoping to draw some rough conversations around Peterson and the ideas that Patricia and Maz have and the ideas that Perry has. That fair? So just to begin, let's try and put our ideas in a pot and see where we get from there. Perry, tell me, because it's obvious from Maz and Patricia's advent that their enterprise was centered around Peterson. How is Colloquia inspired in terms of Peterson's view?
You know, I think a lot of the ethos for the club was directly in response to a lot of what Jordan Peterson used to lecture about. A lot of us didn't know what to make of the whole politically correct movement and identity politics. And we found that the universities were increasingly becoming a space where people could not share an opinion that was in direct opposition to the political norm. So we established a group centered around the concept of steel manning. And steel manning is something I got directly from Peterson. And I think we had this conversation a little bit earlier, but basically it's you're forming the strongest argument that you can for a given position. And it's the opposite of straw manning, where you're attempting to belittle it. So there was a study done where there was a class they were giving this political affiliation quiz, and most of them landed significantly on the left. But then they were told to steel man a conservative argument. And what happened later when they took the quiz again is that everybody kind of gravitated towards the middle. And that's because, as Peterson mentions quite often, in the process of articulating your speech, you start to understand it, you start to embody it, and then the other person doesn't become a distant other. They don't become something formidable or scary. They become somebody that's a person that you can understand. So we attempted to embody this in our weekly meetings, the STOA. And a lot of what Peterson touches on has been integral to how we've structured the club. To shy away from this game of identity politics, to emphasize that language is your ability to think. And the freedom to express what you actually think is the process of formulating intellectual thoughts, right? So, he's been huge to us. He's been one of our maybe our founding figure.
Right. There has also been sort of this trade-off between seeking the truth and hyper-moralization as far as our club is concerned, right? We have sought to not depend or anchor ourselves in the hyper-moral principles that Columbia as a university espouses, and then actively go out in search of seeking the truth. I want to ask you guys, how is it that, apart from the film being about Jordan Peterson, how has he influenced you all?
Well, I guess to start, I knew about Jordan Peterson's work many years ago, 15 years ago probably, back when I was a psychology undergrad. And I was in my existential philosophy phase, trying to figure out the meaning of life and all the big questions. So his work was the perfect thing to land on at that time. And there are many ways that I found his work impactful for me. I'm a very open person, and that made it difficult for me to even figure out, well, what do I want to do career-wise? I'm interested in so many different things. And also, I come from a very religious family, Italian Roman Catholic family, and I went away from religion at a young age. It's kind of like the stereotypical story that you hear a lot. But I guess I always felt a kind of a void or a gap of just having that space to go to deliberate the moral questions and to... I still wanted a religious space, but I never found anything that satisfied that. And I found that a lot of his lectures went to that space, so I was able to go there. And so I found that really interesting and useful. And then I knew that he was a really inspiring professor for a lot of students at the University of Toronto. And that's part of why I later went to approach him about making a film.
Right. I think... what Peterson does is something very similar to how Buddhism allows you to conjugate the atheistic angle that you might preserve inside you with the spiritual or the religious sentiment, because Buddhism is a practice, it's a method, it's not as such a belief architecture. And Peterson allowed even my atheistic sensibilities to be, sort of backed up by a religious, by a metaphysical architecture, right? How did it happen for you? How did you get tagged along this journey?
So I heard about Jordan through Patricia. It was meeting him before really seeing any of his content.
Right.
So we just kind of went over to his place and chatted up about the documentary Patricia wants to make. But your question was how does Jordan influenced or affected? I would say there's been a few ways, but the way that kind of comes popping in my head would be that he's helped me to challenge things that I always just kind of took for granted. And I think it has a bit to do with my background. So my family came to Canada as refugees from Iran, and grew up kind of poor and doing very well now and everything, but so there was something about that and my romanticization with the underdog, I think. And that made me kind of lean more towards left-wing politics.
Right.
And I mean that in a pretty broad way. I mean that in a way without really even thinking about it. And that also has to do with kind of like, underdog, anti-hero figures in film, but also just mainstream culture, how it kind of slightly leans towards the left. I never questioned really any of it. Right. I never questioned what now I understand to be identity politics. I never questioned, looking at if somebody's not doing that well or a group of people aren't doing that well, and the broad stroke statements that you would read and hear about through mainstream media. I never really questioned that stuff. When it came with Jordan and we talked about certain things, it helped me to challenge and shake loose the weaker and very superficial and knee-jerk reactions, opinions, and behaviors that come with that kind of social justice thinking. And it shook all the loose ones away. Right. And what remained were the things that, as you say, can be steel-manned, like that are strong enough to handle criticisms because you're actually thinking about it rather than just renting an opinion from a TV show, a sitcom, an anchor person. Yeah, exactly. Pop culture. I mean, it's all over pop culture in the Anglo world where there's certain things that are just taken for face value and being just accepted. And another person that was really useful was Height. Because Jord would come at a certain angle and he would kind of deviate a little bit, and I got what you're saying, but then I watched this, and also talking to him in conversation, right. And then I saw how YouTube works, you like one thing, then it goes to another thing, and the thing that came up on the side was Height, and it was this talk he had at Duke University, where he kind of did similar to what you're talking about, where first I can't remember specifically what it was, but it was like a statement about, it had to do with sometimes social justice and truth conflict. Right. And then everybody kind of put up their hand and it was more left-leaning or they agree with certain social justice pillars. But by the end of it, people were more confused. I was like, yes, that. And then what made me that I felt like I was onto something was when I started I shared that specific video on my Facebook. I come from an arts background and like multimedia design, and I always lived like in the cities, and so a lot of my friends are not conservative Christians, not conservative Muslims, and so when I shared a video like that, it got kind of weird. Like people that have known me for a long time start giving me a hard time. Like this one friend, right? He's a white guy and he's telling me this guy's white man explaining. So then I take a step back. He's talking about Height, and I'm like, okay, so which white guy am I supposed to listen to? You or him? Like, what's? So it was like it wasn't even a response to what he was saying. And when that happened, I started to think like, there's something here. I want to go more towards it, right? So what we're finding with the tour, which we'll get into, when people start saying no, not that, that's bad, take it off. People get attracted to it. Some people, right? Some people that are a little bit, maybe a bit more disagreeable, a little bit more curious, a little bit outside of the herd. So I would say those are kind of the first things that I remember about Jordan, kind of that summer that we met him that stood out for me.
Right.
Yeah.
I think when you and I went to the Jonathan Haidt event, he does that one thing to almost illustrate the same point, and what he does is, because he wrote a book called Coddling of the American Mind,
Yeah.
right? And he's like, how many of you are below a certain age and so on? How many of you from this group were not allowed to walk a 6-block radius growing as a child? And then that suddenly translates into the grander point that he's trying to drive, But I want to ask you a particular question, which is, for us, the three of us here, out of the 4 people, we had almost been in interaction with Jordan through an interface, be that books or screens, before we'd actually met him. So we had this understand. You met him without any interface, right?
Yeah, basically.
How is the personality behind all this media chaos that comes about?
You know what's funny about that? When I first met him, and we left his house and we're biking, we lived in the same neighborhood at the time with Jordan, and I look over at Patricia as we're biking down the street, and I say, "Isn't that?" I can't remember the specific word I used, but I was like, "That's so inclusive? How this guy from the country, because the way he speaks, the first thing I noticed is like, oh, he has a very strong rural accent, and some people would say, oh, they think all Canadians talk like that. That's not the case, So
we only one person in Canada.
Yeah, he was very an older guy and kind of like. So I was like, isn't this is interesting? Like he's such a different dude from me. So that was my first kind of impression with him. And then through Patricia, and then when the film started to take off,
right?
The one before this one, the one that had to do with Jordan and his friend, now brother, the carver from Vancouver Island. As I started to get to know Jordan a bit more, and then I started to dabble in a little bit of the videos, but really a lot more with the pronoun videos came up, because I had to know what he was saying, because people were saying things to me that I was like, well, are they right? Or I had to do the research.
Right. Yeah. You have to do diligence.
And then I was like, okay, well, this is the kind of guy that he's like the kind of guy that likes to kind of lay everything out, put all the cards on the table so you know where people stand. So it crystallized it for me when he started to put out those videos, and then I traced it back to what it was like when I first met him, and I was like, yes, the connection's there, because he's a very he doesn't like small talk. I don't really like small talk. He likes to go right at it. He'll ask you a very specific question, and then he's looking at you, looking for an answer, like right in your eye, and so when it all jumped off and things got very heated and he said what he said, it all made sense, given if I look back retroactively on kind of his personality or how he is, and what's important for him, like when we were signing the papers, the consent for it, Tammy.
That was for him to be in the documentary.
For him to be in the film. So Tammy is very different from Jordan. Tammy's wife is more disagreeable. She'll kind of say what she has to say. Jordan's like that too, but Jordan's he's sometimes not. He's a bit more polite.
He's more polite than her.
Yeah,
That's interestingly surprising.
Right.
Yeah, it's really 180. There's so many curveballs to talk about with getting to know them personally. And so Tammy had some issues. Tammy, she was like, because these consent forms
are awful.
They're very broad. It's like forever in the universe, just to sign off, and that's just kind of standard.
Yeah. And we had to deal with the broadcaster, so we kind of, we had to have all these certain rights in order for it to go. And there's one physicist I interviewed that was like, "Hey, I'm not going to give you the rights for the whole universe. I'll just give you for planet Earth." And that was edited. They're quite ridiculous.
That was the literal thing you said.
Oh, it literally says the universe.
Yeah, that's
very interesting.
And so Tammy, we had this thing where we were kind of working it out, and she was like, "Well, I'm not signing it." And then the way Jordan is with that is that he's very individualistic. So he was like, okay, well, if you don't want it, you do your thing, And I like that, because I never liked the idea of carrying somebody else's concerns and problems. We each should carry our own.
Right.
That's how we can move forward, and I think that's why this part of the world is doing so well. So I related to him on that, and it was just really cool to think back of these little instances that were highlights of his personality, which have kind of now been this figure for people that is pretty ubiquitous.
Yeah.
Patricia, I have a question for you. The class you took was Maps and Meaning, correct?
I didn't actually officially take any of his classes because I was at a different university, but then I sort of audited a class that a friend of mine was taking at U of T. But no, it was the personality class, Maps and Meaning.
I see.
But then later I attended the Maps and Meaning classes anyway, filming lectures. So yeah, I've seen it all.
Gotcha. So I read the Maps and Meaning lecture text, and it's fascinating. But how much do you think he practices what he preaches? Right, because it seems like he's deriving a lot of who he is and how he presents himself to the public from these principles that he's established studying these totalitarian regimes and how to create, like, the ideal society and then the ideal member of the society. Like, what did you think of that experience?
I think he certainly strives to, and I think all that's happened in the last 4 years has been a manifestation of him trying to live out his beliefs and his philosophy, but it's a messy, complicated world. And there's a scene in the film where he's having a conversation with his friend, an author, Greg Hurwitz, and he says to him, I don't want to become the opposite to neo-Marxism. And this is a conversation happening in 2015, so it was before those videos came out, but they were talking about just some, instances of kind of politically correct things happening on campus. And so he was very well aware of the fact that if he's gonna, go out and push back or speak against these things, he's risking himself becoming kind of possessed by the opposite ideology.
Right.
And I think those forces did have an effect on him for sure.
Right.
But I think he's doing his best to
stand up to the values.
To stand up to the values,
Right.
even if it's imperfect.
And those values are very contentious values in the context of the broader world as a whole, and I think that is part of the reason why he's come out like this. But I don't. From what I remember from last night, you guys were not trying to make a film about the rise of Jordan Peterson. Technically, it started off as a more tame venture.
Oh, initially when we started the film.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It started off as you documenting his friendship with a native Canadian carver, his friend, right? And then suddenly the videos come out. So what was happening? What's the story?
Oh, yeah, that was crazy. So Maz was speaking about, these early days of us biking over to his house, and we see all this like native artwork in his home. So we learn about his friendship with Charles Joseph. So at that time we learned that he was adding a third floor to his home, and it was going to have all these totem poles which were very sacred, and they're being carved by Charles Joseph, who's part of the Kwakwaka'wakw tribe around Vancouver Island on west coast of Canada.
Right.
So we learned that this was a kind of a big part of his life. We learned about Charles Joseph, who's this phenomenal, really raw character. He dreams what he's going to carve, and he's visited by his grandparents and great grandparents in his dreams, and just like has so many. He's one of the few carvers in his community that actually, when he carves, he knows the legends and the stories behind them, and that's such important knowledge. And the other important thing to say about Charles is he's a residential school survivor. So in Canada, there's a dark history of kids, native kids, being taken from their families at a young age, being put into residential schools, being told that they can't speak their language, their hair is cut short, and they were sexually abused, and a lot of them died. And so this happened to Charles beginning at the age 6.
When was this? When were the residential schools around?
The latest one closed at like an embarrassingly late year. I think it's something like in the 90s.
Wow.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
It was the way the church dealt with having the children of the natives learn English and be Christian and be civilized, right?
It's like colonization.
100%.
Like a post-colonial, like in that sense, right?
Yes.
Australia and New Zealand have very similar histories.
Right, so you were documenting that.
So I was documenting Charles and Jordan's friendship. They've known each other for 15 years, and they're like such opposites, but they complement each other in unique ways. And Charles's family was actually adopting Jordan into his family. So after this ceremony, they would literally become brothers. And I filmed this sacred potlatch ceremony where Jordan is being blanketed. He's been given a sacred name in Kwakwala, which is Charles's language. And then suddenly, it was pretty sudden to me, Jordan published those videos in fall 2016. It had been a year and a half that we were working on the film, and I didn't see it coming at all. and then everything changed.
These videos were Bill C-16?
There were other things he was criticizing as well, but that's where he criticized Bill C-16 and political correctness on university campuses.
Right.
Yeah.
So the video of him screaming because the mic's not working and him sitting in front of the laptop, that they came about around this time?
I think I don't know exactly which video you're referring
So
to.
there was this one, and it's part of your film as well, where there is people interrupting his protest. So
That's
they're
at the
pulling-
rally.
Oh,
It was
right.
before that.
Oh,
So
even
the
before.
rally was held in response to he released 3 videos on YouTube called
Uh-huh.
Professor Against Political Correctness, and they're
Right.
just like, professory lectures, just like all this text on screen. It was
With a
before
PowerPoint.
it was before he
Corbell
learned,
font.
before he got better at at making videos.
I can imagine him doing that so
yeah.
Exactly. So he
Yeah.
released these long videos. I was BCC'd on the email he sent out to a bunch of colleagues saying like, hey, what do you guys think about this? And I think he was hoping to start a conversation about this. And the videos went viral and all this news started to hit, especially with the most controversial part of the videos was his opposition to Bill C-16 and him refusing the legal the fact that the law was adding the use of alternative trans pronouns.
Right,
to,
a compelled speech. That's where he pins that, right?
Yes,
and then
yeah.
there was almost like I wouldn't go the distance to say conscious, but like an active misinterpretation of what he was trying to protest. And so there was this phenomena of his protesters and him talking past each other, and that comes out of the film as well to some degree.
Yeah,
right?
so there was a lot of talking past for sure.
In the hindsight, what do you see is the grander point or the sharpest point that you're trying to drive about Peterson and this entire journey that he went on in his late 50s? What do you think about that?
In the film?
Yeah.
I think, so having witnessed all of this with a front row seat and then seeing what all of the media portrayals have been, as well as the conversations with people, being at opposite ends of the spectrum of interpretation and perception of the situations, I felt that it was really important to just show all this complexity that I saw, that like I didn't have the luxury of being in either of these bubbles, which are far from the truth from what I witnessed. So it's really just about like showing the complexity and nuance, which to me is a more accurate representation of the reality of what happened. It's really just to show that and let people make their decisions and have their perceptions based on at least knowing that more what I see as a more accurate portrayal of what happened.
Right.
It's like that line, I'll butcher it, but the gist would be, in a world of lies, telling the truth is revolutionary.
Right.
That's it. So I think about, so much of documentary, art, film, so many things has activism in it, and it's so dumbed down. And I feel like a lot of work out there doesn't really respect the intelligence of the audience because it tells them here's this, and maybe we'll do a curveball here just to make it interesting, throw some conflict in there and be balanced.
Right.
But at the end of the day, here's where we're going to take you. And I think that it makes people less sophisticated in their reflection of society, but it's also their fault too. It's a chicken and egg,
Right. There is a demand for it too.
There's a demand for it. It's like I go here, climate change this, and killer whales that, and so the film that we wanted to make is we wanted to make a film that respects people's intelligence, where we lay out as close as we can to what happened in an honest way, and let people decide for themselves, and kind of use Jordan in this context. It's kind of a bit like an avatar. So it's kind of like Jordan is a guy who lived out his philosophy in the real world, and this is what happened, and what can observers learn from that? Because it's like, tell the truth, and those 12 rules, and he handpicks a few, and then he behaves that way in the world and online, and look what happens. And online it's just completely binary. Either you're this or you're that.
Right.
And if it's related to your bank account and your career, then you want to be part of that. You don't want to do something where your followers are going to get mad at you and give you a hard time, because then you're like, holy shit, I'm going to get a bunch of unsubscribes for this. I better not do that again. If you have a more of a right wing following, and then you criticize Trump legitimately, and then you get a lot of hate for it, but maybe you're not going to do that twice. And then on the other side is that if you say like, so-and-so did have a good point, You know, we should talk about that. We should steelman that conservative argument.
Right.
And then they're going to be like, it seems like the left can be pretty intolerant, which is weird. That was a surprise to me. And now we're kind of facing it because you hear stories, right? This happened to that person in this video. And it's like, okay, everything with a grain of salt, everything with a grain of sugar.
Right.
But when it happens right to you and when you were there, you were like, well, isn't it a shame that the ones that are supposed to be the most tolerant and protect marginalized groups and all that stuff I took for granted and took at face value, it actually isn't really like that. Not even that deep. Just go one level under, and you'll see it all there, and they'll show their own biases.
Right.
You know?
I think there's going to be very few people I know who will voluntarily handpick the kind of controversy Peterson found himself in, and I think to some degree, Perry with Colloquia tried to do that. He took on the amount of controversy that might have come for the sake of his own values, for the sake of what he believed in. And I want to ask you, because you've been having tough conversations, you've been hosting tough conversations with almost just your face and the entire team behind you. What has your experience been with respect to what Maz and Patricia say?
Well, I think you hit it pretty spot on, is that when you allow a taboo to fester, meaning like this conversation, this topic you cannot go near, people are drawn to it, right? And it actually builds somebody's phenomenon. So like Milo Yiannopoulos, right? The more you censor him, the more popular he got, and it just kept happening. But then one long form dialogue where his thoughts were challenged, and then poof, people are like, oh, this is what that was like.
Right. The fetish is not allowed to be, when in suppression and repression, there is a fetish of that issue then. And then as soon as Milo was allowed to blossom, everybody was like, no, he stinks.
Yeah, but specifically in universities, like this should be the environment where people come to challenge all ideas. If I believe something, the university should make me uncomfortable enough where that belief is uprooted, and then I have to figure out, is this what I really think? And you also hit it again, where I think a lot of the problem is that people are allowing other people to think for them, right? Where you're just stuck on all these other platforms, and this is the opinion that you're going to follow regardless of your own thought.
Yeah. I feel like social media gives a lot of information and it connects us, but it's really a lot of headline reading, and I've been guilty of it too, man. Like there'll be something we're like, okay, that must be good, I'll share that, and then somebody would share something on my wall that he thinks I'll like, and but I know they actually haven't actually read it, So it's just this low resolution kind of sharing of information.
Yeah, I also think as soon as you remove the eye-to-eye contact when you communicate something, you allow for me to almost hit you without ever hitting you and run the opposite direction. And that's what sort of polarizes the two sides. It's like, I don't have to risk the implicit threat of violence, and Peterson says that implicit threat of violence between men when I shit on you, right? So I can almost be like, hey, your project, I don't think so, and I can run the other way, and that's how But how is the face-to-face, the face-to-face interaction been since? Because you've been touring with your film for a while, you've been screening it across America for...
Yeah, we premiered in Toronto, we had a world premiere, sold it out. Well, let me back up a bit. So, a bit of industry talk. Usually what you want to do is you want to get a theatrical run. And it's a traditional theatrical run, which means a cinema, ideally in an urban center, does 4 screenings a day, more or less, for a week. And that's, you split the box office, and that's a typical situation where established reviewers of films in that country, in that city, will come out and see the film, or you send them a screener. If you don't really have that, it's not really on their radar. So what happened was that we were confirmed for a full week run at a cinema called the Carlton in downtown Toronto, and some staff complained about the film and felt uncomfortable by it, and so they pulled the run. They were very apologetic, but it really screwed up our margins. So then kind of what we had to do, we had to kind of zoom out and say, okay, well, how can we get it in theaters? And we went with the model of a cinema on demand. Cinema on demand, most people aren't familiar with it. In the States, there's a company called Gather. In Canada, and the UK, and Ireland, it's called Demand. And in Australia, it's called FanForce. Different companies basically do this thing where they crowdsource movie tickets. And if a certain minimum amount of tickets are sold, the screening happens. Right. So it's kind of like a special event at a commercial cinema where we do all the marketing. There's no billboard or anything like that. It's just independent event. And usually given kind of like second tier cities, like outside a bit, or off nights like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And so that's what happened, and that was basically our world premiere. And across Canada, actually, right now, there's screenings all across, matinee. So that was the way we kind of got it out to people. But the obstacles we faced had to do with the people that haven't seen the film at all, and just the idea of a film about Jordan Peterson meant the film about Jordan Peterson for them was just as bad as what they feel the guy represents himself. It was a shame because, and you guys have seen the film, it's like, this isn't a look at the SJWs are going crazy again, and look at the left wing is taking over, and what are we going to do with the Western canon, and we got Sharia over here, and it's like all that shit that you'll find. It wasn't what they thought it was going to be, and it's a shame because they'll never know, because they're not going to go and watch it. So that was kind of the obstacles we faced with the mainstream. And guess what? It happened again in Brooklyn. So we came to New York a few days ago for our first American audience Thursday night at a place called Shapeshifter Lab in Brooklyn. And that sold out, and we had a great time. And we added a second screening, which was set up weeks ago for this Sunday. Today, yeah. And some staff complained about the film, and again they canceled our run, so we had to refund everybody. This one really actually hurt because we came and we invested and we put ad money into the screening, and we did this meetup talk with a bunch of folks, and we invited them to come, and the sales were going up, and they ended up pulling out. We got the email last night at 11 p.m. The night before the screening. And so that's kind of what it's been like face to face, right? It's this annoying kind of coddling of the staff, when really what should have happened, right? What should have happened is that if they had concerns, they don't have to come directly to us, because I know sometimes that can be a bit, like, not everybody's into that direct kind of thing, especially if you're part of a group that's vulnerable. And we can say, trans and non-binary folks, I mean, that it comes with that. So we understand that because we've studied it and we've met so many people of that kind of walk of life. But what should have happened is that the owner of the venue has their staff, but they also have the obligation that they made to us. Let's have a conversation about it. Let's meet.
Right.
And really, I'd really love to know, what was it about the film that rubbed them the wrong way or made them feel offended, because the venue is quite small. So the bar staff and the audio staff were watching the film during the Thursday night premiere, so they saw the film.
Right.
So I'm just so curious. It's like, but that conversation can't happen now because it should have happened, and the screening could have maybe have been saved. But more importantly than that is, we're just curious about what they thought about it, and we want them to know who we are. We use preferred pronouns. With Lane, we use they. We feel that, I feel that, like, young people, like, these people that worked at the bar are very young, and they're working out through their identities and the things that they were going through, and gender dysphoria is a real thing. Body dysphoria is a real thing. When a skinny girl looks in the mirror and she sees a fat girl, like, that's very hard on every aspect of life. When it comes to gender dysphoria, it gets even more tricky and complicated because it's just not something people are used to.
Right.
And so there's certain complications and insecurities and kind of stigmatizations associated with that. And what I really want to do is just kind of explain ourselves, which we weren't really able to do,
And to better understand, we also have no idea if it had to do with that. Like, we don't know what aspect of the film they were really uncomfortable with. And when we first responded to them letting us know it was canceled, the first thing we said was like a long, compassionate reply to the staff, and kind of reaching out to say, like, we would really love to understand what this is specifically about, because that's important for us to know.
It's not about winning an argument, or like somebody comes to you and he didn't say that, but he has a problem with the law. So it's not that's not our style when it comes to people. That if we generally feel that something we did hurt you or felt you felt offended by it. And it goes back to what you said about height with the helicopter parents. It's like, okay, so here's the interesting thing. It's like you have the staff, and they're like the children of the owners of the place. And the owners of the place are saying, no, they're hurt, we're going to take care of them.
Right.
These people, what are they going to learn from the situation? So Jordan is this 8 feet tall like guy who's going to like blows fire and he'll burn you to death, you know? I know, because dealing with this stuff and researching this doc is like, I got to know a lot of right-wingers, like conservatives in Texas and stuff, like they're hosting us, and I got to kind of know them, and they got to kind of know me. I'm a Iranian refugee. Hi, have you ever met somebody like me, you know? And vice versa. So it's like, now that I got to know some of these guys and kind of broke down some of the things of why they like a guy like Trump. Like, I think Trump's a cunt, you know, but why do they like him?
Right.
That's important for me to understand. If I'm actually an artist, if I'm actually a creator making stuff for the public sphere, I need to understand that. That's important for me because that's interesting. It's an intellectual pursuit of kind of going into the foreigner's land, right? And understanding their dialect and kind of bringing it back to my own camp. So what I learned from that is that it actually made me tougher. It made me be able to understand, and it destigmatized these monster-like people. And it's like, oh, it's just some guy who likes to meme and play with that keke shit.
Right.
And he's just kind of like plays Call of Duty, and he just likes the fury of a guy like Trump. It's like, if I sit down with this guy and I break down certain things that I like, that he likes, we have a lot more in common. And I've done this a few times already. We have so much more in common than social media would let on. So this is a missed opportunity, and it sucked that we couldn't, because these folks, you know, they're walking away from the situation completely vulnerable, or like exaggerating what this guy or maybe us are as this weapon against their dignity and identity and humanity. But if you actually met with us and learned kind of what we're coming from and what we're trying to do with the doc, it would make you stronger.
Right.
But that's not what happened, and it goes back to what Hait's talking about and what you talked about.
Right. And it also seems to be exactly on the money as far as what you were doing.
Quote unquote.
Right?
Yeah.
I did an interview with him a very long time ago for a project at school, and you would not believe it's absolutely to the T, the exact same thing he said a year and a half, roughly, something like that. Yeah. So would you let me invite you to make a guess, right? If you were to say, from having seen the film very freshly, what would it be so specifically inside the film that would trigger people away from it? And let's not resort to the symptomatic aspect of, you know, it's because we get the caudal part. What scene, what shot, what do you think would it be?
You know, I'm trying to figure out exactly what it would be, as objectively as I possibly can. To me, it seems like there's this reactionary response that we see all the time in universities now, where if you give somebody any type of platform, you're validating all of their statements, right? And I love that you guys said that you created the film with the idea that the viewership is intelligent, right? Because what the other option is that, you know, when you deplatform somebody because you're afraid that they're going to indoctrinate everybody in the audience, you're not giving them that due credibility, saying that they're people that can think for themselves. As far as what's inherently polarizing about Jordan Peterson, I think that people, similar to what Jonathan Haidt points out, is that when somebody really stands for something, takes a stand, right, and that's in opposition to your feelings at the time, people don't know how to deal with that.
How to discern feeling and thought from each other.
How to take a solid no. I will not use this pronoun if mandated by the law. But Jordan Peterson has said many times that in an interpersonal relationship, if you choose to be recognized this way, then I will respect that too, right? But to me, it seems that either people come in preloaded with the idea of the myth of Jordan Peterson, and as we were talking about earlier, that, you know, many people get their information from tertiary sources. So it's never that I listened to his lecture and this is what I thought. It's that I heard this commentary on his lecture and this is what they led me to believe.
You would be so surprised. So many of our meetings before events, we would talk about how we will manage. We've never had an instance of protest, but we're thinking about how we manage security. and then we'd load up some tall ass, big ass dudes like we'd be like, okay, you guys man. And it's hilarious the fact that we would invite speakers and we would have to have Indian dudes guard the whole process. But you know what I think, and this is probably the most ironical aspect in my estimation, what really pushes people over the edge is exactly the stuff that pushed us over the edge as fans of Peterson, which was the tweets that you pulled out from him that were, you know, stuff that he would regret as well. It's hilarious that you were actually trying to bring out the flaws, let's just say, in the man, right? And that would actually push people away from
I think he actually didn't regret those tweets, by the way. He did.
I do think.
No, he actually made that comment when we watched it. He said, I don't think those were that bad. Just for the record.
I think those tweets are pretty good too, because think about, one of them was what was one of them? It was about
Islam.
Do you think feminism avoids criticism of Islam because they inherently wish for
unconsciously desire
masculine dominance.
That hit me so hard. I haven't forgotten about it since yesterday.
I know.
And I think that is exactly there is some deep-seated truth there, in my view, and that's just me.
But the problem is one, he has this whole background that you have to consider, right? So this question is rooted in Jungianian psychology, right?
Yeah.
The desire for male dominance, is that a factor in the feminine category? So like there's actually a consideration to be put here, and obviously people are like this. They go immediately to this is sexist, this is wrong, this is not what Islam says, and all of that. But like he points out something that has some type of intellectual credibility to it, or at least a curiosity.
And it's at the end of the day, it's a question. It's not a statement. And he believes, we should be able to ask these questions and to think, right? It's like no one's going to ask that question because it's too politically incorrect. But then you can't think. So
I think as a society we've forgotten that the grand discourse that we have outside is a buffet model, not like you don't have to eat if somebody puts that on the table. It's your choice whether you pick it up or not. And I think Zizek points to this as well. He's like, as soon as you abandon following the teleology of thought to come to its conclusion, you succumb to this defeat, which is hyper-moralization. And that seems to bleed into this symptomatic affair that you guys have been dealing with. But let me ask you, how do you plan on dealing with it? How do you plan on going about it? I guess we're sort of fighting Jordan's war on a second-hand level now.
We've been criticized for that too, right? I've been talking with a lot of other documentary filmmakers in Canada. There's these chats we have, and we've been accused of adopting right-wing narratives and talking points just because we're talking publicly about what's been happening with theaters, and it's more than just the Carlton and Shapeshifter here in New York. There have been other theaters that we've been kind of running up to these barriers that are ideological. And so how are we going to deal with it? That's a good question.
We spent today just replying to emails and not letting people get away with half-truths. Or if they manipulate something we said, we get in there and we spend the time to say, no, that's not what we meant, and this and that, just to make sure that you always want to do that, to say, it's kind of like, back to something Jordan says, it's kind of like, and even before him, is like, have a knife and let them know you have it, but don't take it out.
Right.
Don't make sure these two, don't fuck with them. Don't lie, and don't try to put them in a corner. And be dishonest, So that's one way.
And I noticed that where that first happened was actually when we tried to take that compassionate approach, and that's often why it's tricky, because sometimes when you take a compassionate approach, that gets easily manipulated, because it's like you're showing vulnerability of like, maybe there's something more I could have done, and it's like this is kind of on you, and so right away I wanted to really step up and be like, no, now you're manipulating what I said. That's actually not what this was.
It was like it's kind of like apologizing in a tweet, and it just is a huge mistake.
Which is so unfortunate that there isn't space to be able to actually take something back or reconsider what you said. It makes actual dialogue so difficult.
Yeah. It's interesting that you guys pulled two rules out, right? Just be precise in your speech, and then the other one is
speak the truth, or at least don't lie.
But then the other one was just let people know that you have teeth and you're willing to use it.
Is that a rule?
No, I don't know.
It's
13 in the follow-up.
Might be in the follow-up. The next 12.
I'm really waiting for that. But have you guys considered emailing Joe Rogan? I'm pretty sure
We have.
We've
it's
emailed him. He hasn't replied yet, but we'll keep trying.
No,
Send him a
with
trailer.
all this new update, I am so sure because he really takes a truck against phenomena like this. He did that with the comedian that we were bringing on to campus as well.
Oh yeah.
Right,
I watched
Dinesh
that.
Patel, yeah. We were
Yeah.
trying to get him on campus too for an event, and the whole. No, he came to Columbia. The event happened. He was pulled off because he cracked a joke that was too racist for the population who invited him. Like Google him, research on him before you invite him. And then he went on Joe Rogan and he could make a case for himself. And I think
Yeah.
if this continues happening, Rogan's a brilliant platform.
For sure.
Okay, on the flip side of the equation, this is the activism that comes to your art, right? Let's talk about, as far as discourse and art is concerned, discourse for you and art for you. How do you conceptualize activism with your art or with your discourse? How do you do that at Colloquia? And how does this sort of dance with their idea?
I guess on university campuses, it's harder to have a conversation that has this activist environment around it objectively. What Colloquia does is we try not to hold a position ourselves, where we attempt to illuminate a problem and then illuminate the different aspects of arguments between it. But I'm sure, as you guys have pointed out many times throughout, that people actually want you to take a position when you're trying to, like, anytime there's like contentious topic, they want you to be on the right side of it. The
It's
correct
not
side of
ethical
it.
to say that you're being unbiased or objective.
Yeah.
Right. Nobody believes you when you say that.
Yeah.
Where journalism is now absent in this, right? Because documentarianism, objectivity it's a pretty strong value, right?
I don't know, not the way it used to be. That's part of the conversations that I've been having with a lot of other documentary filmmakers about this film. Like, one of the themes that kept coming up in the exchanges was, how can you make a balanced film? I don't actually use the word balance to describe the film, but a lot of people do. But how do you make a balanced film about someone who's unethical? That's kind of how they see it, just flat out.
Right.
And it's like, do you make a balanced film about Trump or Steve Bannon, et cetera, et cetera?
They
That's
begin
how
with
it's
the
seen.
presumption of evil, right?
Right.
It's
Yes.
not that I disagree with this person or that he's wrong. It's that he's inherently a dark figure.
Yeah.
And the challenge with that is, it immediately puts me in the position of having to defend Jordan. And
Right.
I'm not here to speak for him or to defend him. I'm making a film about a situation and a person where I see a lot of complexity and nuance. And not because I'm trying to be balanced, but because that's how it is. That's what I actually see.
Right. I think Cornel West, I think he's a professor at Harvard, he made a statement saying that art allows you to see society horizontally, like in a cross-sectional format.
Yeah.
And I think you guys do that well. And even if it's not balanced to you, I still think it's dialectical in the sense that you, without conflicting the two opposite sides of the art, without bringing them in absolute conversation and deciding a winner for everybody else, you leave the two sides of Jordan's conversation, pro-Jordan and anti-Jordan, very open, right? And you bring in this this recurring character or figure in that in the film, Lane, right? That's his name. What do you think about the perception of that? And you also capped it off at telling me that Lane was in fact they liked the film towards the end. How did Lane's participation work with the film?
So Lane is a non-binary activist that was present at the trans teach-in that happened in actually a week before the free speech rally, which became highly popularized on YouTube. So I interviewed Lane shortly after that, and then afterwards Lane actually decided they didn't want to participate in the film and kind of had a rough time with how public and how active they wanted to be in a film like this. And also because in those early days things were so tense, and people really didn't like the idea of giving Jordan Peterson a platform, and making a film about this was seen as equivalent to giving Jordan Peterson a platform. So I decided to just keep in touch with Lane because I felt that Lane had a really unique perspective on this situation.
Smart too.
Yeah, and Lane wasn't the only non-binary person or activist that I was speaking to, but I said, okay, well, even if you don't want to be in the film, that's fine. I don't want to pressure you, but let's just keep in touch because I want to know how this is affecting you.
Right.
And it was probably a year later that Lane decided to participate in the film again, and they felt that it was kind of a duty that they should participate, actually. So when we watched the film with them, this was a shorter television cut that we released in Canada a year ago. It was so interesting watching the film with them, and the comments that struck us were they felt like they were accurately represented and respectfully represented, which is like not common in terms of the experiences they've had with the media before. So that felt really great. It's like, you know, the most stressful thing for me when first showing the film to Lane and Jordan was, I hope that they really feel like they're accurately represented here, and you know, they can't see the cut until it's done, just for that journalistic integrity. So you know, that's highly stressful both for them and for us.
Right, I can imagine.
So hearing that meant a lot. And then Lane said things like, do you think Jordan would ever have a beer with me? And this is the first time I'm actually hearing a lot of what Jordan has to say through his own mouth. So, you know, Lane was open to talking more, even though there were a lot of things that they still felt like, yeah, but no, I disagree with Jordan there, like important points. And, you know, totally fair game. But
it's not a film we made for people to all line up to go to Jordan's birthday party.
Right.
Like, it's okay if you don't, like, but, you know, our duty, right? So if you're making work for the public sphere, you should be able to help people understand the zeitgeist. Trump is a phenomenon. People are going to look back at this time and be like, there's something going on there. And if you're living at that time, you have to be able to understand it, or at least talk about it intelligently. That's what we think we were trying to do with the doc, in part, is to reflect back to society as like, here's something what's happening. Jordan is an avatar. You have all these characters in it, and they're all kind of fighting, and it's this weird, chaotic kind of like war. But with reflection and with conversation, because that's really the most important part. And I think when you guys said this, when we screened it with you guys, it's like you got the film and you got the conversation, and they're both equally as important, because you don't really get anywhere if you watch something on your own without reflection. And we shared the screener with this guy, this theater guy, Dublin, and he saw the film and he's like, I really regret not seeing it with somebody, because I watched it and I'm like, I want to talk about it.
That's one of my favorite comments.
Yeah, so that was really flattering, you know, because then it's provoking thought.
Right.
You know.
And one more thing I want to add too is, part of my intention with the film, you know, I talked about wanting to illustrate complexity, and that's kind of on the intellectual level, but also a lot of film is about making you feel a certain way. And I think the reason why this idea of balance comes out in the film is because I wanted it to feel like a bit of a roller coaster of like, yes, I agree with this, or no, now I disagree with this, and so it makes it an uncomfortable film, which is difficult, because people, like, you know, not everybody is open to the idea of watching an uncomfortable film. But that was important to me, because that's what my experience over the last 4 years has been like. I was very uncomfortable, and there were these kind of ups and downs and confusion, and it wasn't like a crystal clear, well, Jordan is the hero and Lane is the villain. No, and a lot of the formulas for story structure really kind of push, you know, it neatly fits when you designate your hero and your villain, but it was really important for me to work hard to not make the film come off that way, and to make it more nuanced and complex in terms of those dimensions. So there's that element of discomfort a lot.
You know why I wanted you to talk about how Lane felt about the entire process is because almost all four of us in the ventures that we are involved in can quite easily succumb to the tendency of placing the blame on the other, as if like it's the progressive left that does not understand, right? It really does not seem to be the case. It is as if one conversation can change your entire perception. It could veil away this curtain that's been. And me and him, we've known each other since both of us moved to New York. We disagree so thoroughly on so many things, and we agree and that's true for the entire board and the club as a whole. We don't know what our personal views are. Him and I know, because we're friends, but apart from that, we can still manage to have a civil conversation. Think about something like, can we get a beer afterwards, even with all that disagreement in place? And to some degree, it goes back to how social media facilitates the antithesis of that. The conversation is so farcical that you never really understand the person behind it. And in that sense, you guys also managed to pick up on some of Peterson's human sides, him crying, him feeling broken, or Danny feeling broken, his family going through what they went, the brother and the sister, the daughter and the son. What do you think is that? What kind of an impact does humanizing Peterson have on somebody who is so directly opposed, and somebody who's so pro Peterson in the same vein of thought? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So it's like another, I guess, controversial element for some people, the fact that we're making Jordan a human in this film. It's like, you
A
can't do
human
that
being.
to the devil.
Right.
But, you know, that came from a few different places. One is I'm just really interested in human films. So, and I started this project off making a human film about Jordan before this politics started, and then after that it's like he wasn't allowed to be human anymore, but
Right.
it was already human, so you know that sort of continued. And you know, being so close to all of this happening, I didn't feel that it would be useful for me to put out another kind of set of talking head interviews, because they're already out there. There's so much of that. There's a huge saturation. There's podcasts, there's YouTube videos, and what I could offer was a unique look, both to, you know, humanize Jordan and to humanize Lane, and because also the culture war was something that was like running through at the bottom the entire time that we were working on this, and we were realizing that it was important for us to continually take that into context in the approach we were taking to make the film. And at the end of the day, it's so important for us to be able to see each other as humans if we're going to be able to have conversation, as you spoke to
Right.
earlier.
Right. Let me push that a little harder. Would you say,
Okay.
and you particularly, because you have such a strong view on Trump, would you say it is still important for us? Because I see that as a grossly disgusting sentiment, that you cannot humanize a person, right? And as much as I personally disagree with Trump, I think it is very important to humanize him, to place him in the context, and and from there understand what he's doing. Would you agree with that? Would you say that is the case?
I would. I would say that you can make a documentary about Trump if he lets you, but he wouldn't let you
He'd
go
be a
in his
satire.
life because he knows
Right.
he wouldn't let you. He keeps his distance from people, and if anybody in his own staff start talking back or talking about him in a way he doesn't like, they're out.
Yep.
So, but let's say hypothetically you could, a Trump-like
If it was a
guy,
completely pro-narcissistic production.
then
obviously.
he'd love it, and then he'll say how independent the filmmakers were,
Right.
and
right.
we'll get that check.
But don't you try the same, right? Because I see you every board meeting, in and out, every STOA, in and out. You take up all these, and we've discussed transgender issues. We've discussed some really, really dark shit for Prakhar 3 years ago. You humanize those issues, and you humanize the sides of those two issues. Like the way I described Colloquia as this potluck buffet model where you can walk in, meet with a set of courageous people who are willing to suspend their individual beliefs for the sake of the inquiry of truth for itself, right? You've humanized some of the darkest things I know, in intellectually speaking. I'm more funny, but intellectually speaking. What do you think about that? What do you think about that as a successful venture for you, or for Colombia as a whole?
I think it should be the standard. It's actually so confusing to me that people want to remove the human element out of the decisions people make. Take the worst, like you could take Hitler, right? In order to make sure that another Hitler doesn't arise again, you have to understand Hitler. You have to know everything that got him to that point.
Yeah.
Everything from his artwork to his relationships, to his relationship with his parents, to his Jewish ancestry. All these things kind of amalgamate.
He had
into-
Jewish ancestry?
Yes.
I don't know that.
He had a Jewish girlfriend too, didn't he?
I don't know. No, she wasn't Jewish. I think it's...
Oh no, that was the intellectual, the philosopher. Heidegger had a
Yeah.
Jewish girlfriend. Yeah, he was a Nazi
Yeah.
too.
But I think that's what one of the most beautiful aspects of filmmaking is that it very much places the human into anything that you're trying to communicate. Books have the visual element removed from it, right? So in descriptive terms, they try to humanize the person. In interviews and things like that, it's like almost cut. It's just right to the point. But in film, if you lack the human element, then one, people don't care about it. People won't watch it. People won't go near it. Nobody will remember it. But specifically in moments like this, if you want to understand whether you like Jordan Peterson or not, whether you're completely opposed to him or you think that he is some type of prophet, there's a man there, and how did the man get there? And in any topic, I think if you want to say that I hold a position, you should understand all the aspects of that given position. If you think you disagree with somebody, then you should do your due diligence in fully understanding that person to the best of your ability before you figure out what it is that you disagree with,
What do you think is the most controversial topic we've done with Colloquia? We did Trump. Trump was recently.
So we did Trump 2020. We did Islam and its compatibility with Western values.
Right.
We did whether or not we should use the N-word in the club. We did gender pronouns.
Right. And of course, there is there is no way you can humanize an issue, but you can humanize the voice behind the issue. And in some sense, what we try to do is we try to humanize the voice behind. So tell me, with this set of the most contentious issues that you've picked up for Colloquia, have you seen a better than average conversation, a conversation that was not on each other's throats trying to stab each other? What is your experience with respect to that for Colloquia?
We've never actually had a conversation where people just like attacked each other and it just went into chaos.
Neither of that. Right?
And it wasn't even that we curated the environment. A lot of times we get people that are brand new to the meetings, but we just tell them like, okay, this is a game. This is a game where we're going to try to play objectively with ideas. All you have to do is stick to the position that you're given. But it's also the most important thing, because like Trump is a good example. People that voted for Trump are people. And they have their own set of rationales as to how they got there. And if you want to understand how they got there and then change their mind, you have to understand them on their terms first. But also recognize that the humanity in them as well.
The 1 week you were missing when we did a discussion on whether Chinese students or foreign students, if the government deems fit, should they be surveillanced, because that was something that was being discussed at university campus, especially with our president here. And you weren't there for that, but the most interesting thing I saw was there was a bunch of Chinese students showed up that do not usually come, first timers. They took the position and they were like, yeah, we should be surveillance, yeah.
Really?
They made that,
really?
And they did not even do it half-assed. It was like one of them made such a strong point. I was like, whoa, man.
The steel man.
Yeah, I was like, I'm walking out. How the hell can you say I should be subject to some kind of a surveillance? And that shows you how far we can distance ourselves from the idea to pursue the idea for the idea's sake, right? Which brings out the stronger side on the other hand.
And even to bring it full circle, like again, like this is something we just got from Peterson, right? And it's interesting because we don't have to be there for this to happen. Our meetings just kind of run on their own. People participate in the game, and then I always hear back saying that it was amazing to see so many different people steelman arguments that directly impact them. We had one board member who's Jewish. He's very sympathetic towards the Zionist movement.
He was in the IDF. He fought for Israel.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh no, this is Alex.
Oh, you mean Alex?
Yeah.
Right. Fair.
So we had a professor who's a Palestinian Zionist, right? So he's more sympathetic towards the Zionist movement. He's very critical of the Palestinian end. But Alex decided to steelman the position that he directly did not hold against this professor in the pursuit of understanding the idea as a whole.
Right. Halfway through, he starts shooting at the professor questions that I never thought would. And I was like, wait a second, is he going off script? What is happening?
Yeah.
And he went on with so much. He was great that day.
Yeah.
That's when we could establish the fact that this could happen without any supervision at all. Like the people had begun to embody this notion that almost descended from Peterson, for us at least, right? Tell me about the filmmaking process, because there is two things in particular that I noticed, and you mentioned one of them. The second I sort of got because it was pretty obvious. One of them was adaptivity, because you guys must have been jumping around with cameras. You had no idea what was coming next. And the second was getting out of the way in terms of your own story.
Yeah. Well, first it helps that we're very small. Jordan said a joke. He's like these two. They were somewhere in between Japanese tourists and family.
Almighty.
Yeah, because we were just kind of like houseplants, and just kind of soaking it all in. And yeah, it's about not inserting yourself into the situation, and just reminding ourselves to be grateful of the opportunity that these people have opened up their lives to us. And a lot of that credit goes to Patricia, because she's such she just asked very smart questions, and I think she, gained a lot of respect from Jordan and Tammy, and they felt like, okay, this is somebody who's not ideological, this is somebody that we can't wait to see what she comes up with. And I think the end result was pretty good.
It's funny because a lot of people talk about the getting out of the way as if it's a really difficult thing, but for me and my personality, it's actually not. Like, getting in the way is difficult for me. So I think it's something that comes pretty natural for me, and that's part of why it works for my style of directing and filmmaking. Like, I don't like contrived stories, and so if I'm in the room filming and you forget that I'm there, perfect. That's exactly where I want it to be.
Right. Because you did get some of the shots that you got. In fact, some of the more meaningful shots that you got, it seemed like they had forgotten that you were there at all, right? Like them almost getting into this disagreement, the husband and the wife and so on.
Right.
There was also this one point me and him were talking about after where Tammy says something about, I lost my husband to the world, right?
Yeah.
That was so meaningful. That sort of because you would wonder what the wife has to go through, right? Finally, there is this one little bit. I think if we can come up with this as an experiment on the mic. Do you think, in your experience of running Colloquia and managing a conversation as successful, do you think you can, is there a bridge between what they will be trying to do with other theaters, the rejections that come? Is there something that they can include in their format of the screening that might be able to negate this blind spot that comes and hits them?
I was actually really curious about that because you guys mentioned that people were saying that when they see something like this that they want to discuss it afterwards to kind of like solidify where they fall, what they think, where everyone else might lie. So in our group we steel man two aspects of a given topic, and I'm really curious to see that, like, say there was an audience and there was a Q&A at the end where people were given the opportunity to see the film, but then afterwards maybe a conversation between, like, say, the Steelman version of the opposition to the film, right? Which is that is it the right thing to do to give a platform to somebody that could be deemed so verbally violent, I guess, or dangerous to society, versus a Steelman argument for somebody that is genuinely contributing towards the lives of many men, that people have found a renewed sense of purpose and meaning and even like religiosity, so like a dialogue in this frame, right, where
I would love that.
Where you could institutionally steel man the two sides to actually project your intent, which is to an inquiry into truth, right? Because you're not trying to take sides. It's very obvious from the film. As somebody who's very pro-Peterson would say, it's very obvious that you're not really trying to take sides. You're trying to bring both or multiple sides of the equation out as the film goes on. If you could institutionalize what we have as a social capital with the STOA, I think you might be able to project your intent a little better.
That's really interesting because we toyed with the idea of screening our film at events that would be called Bring Your Favorite Lefty, Bring Your Favorite Righty.
Yeah.
So we would have a crowd of, a really mixed crowd of people who at least somewhat know each other, so maybe there'll be less hatred in the room.
Right.
But to really have those different perspectives and then watch the same thing and then have a conversation about it. But this would be an interesting way to institutionalize it, especially because most of the people who are likely to come to the film are people who are interested in Peterson, even though there are parts of the film that are uncomfortable for Peterson fans as well.
Right.
Well, I think the biggest benefit is what this allows, and this is what I learned from Peterson again, is it allows
Peterson Chekhovs.
I know, he's in my head. It allows for anonymity. Right? So nobody declares that this is my position, this is what I think, and there's no virtue signaling there. All it is, okay, this is an idea, this is the side of the idea, let me communicate it. In the process of that, they start to embody it, inform it, and then really argue for it. So nobody says, like, this is what I think as a whole of the film, at least in the beginning. But the important thing is that they explore both sides of the steelman, right? So, like, if, say, the entire room does it one way, where this is the reasons why a documentary like this might be worth pursuing, and then they flip and they go the exact opposite. This is why it could be harmful. But then something similar seems to always happen in our STOAs, is that people just
Converge
in the middle,
center.
right? It's never that like one side just wins out throughout, and it's never even about arriving to conclusions. It's just informing you yourself about this is what the spectrum looks like. Let's see where I fall.
And that's just within the room. Outside the room, what you signal is, again, your intent. It's not really to show him in a very Avengers superhero kind of a form at all. It's really to just present something for the sake of it, for what it is, as truthful. That's pretty much all of the things that I had in mind to talk about. Do you guys want to talk about your film for a second? Tell us where we can find it. Tell us where we can find you on social media and so on.
So we are Holding Space Films, and we are on all the social media platforms. The film is called The Rise of Jordan Peterson. In the States, the pre-order link now is live. There's a little sale we're doing until Monday night.
That's on iTunes.
On iTunes.
The Rise of Jordan Peterson.
The Rise of Jordan Peterson. The official release on iTunes is October 29th. You could buy a DVD or Blu-ray on Amazon, pre-order everywhere outside of the States. It's on iTunes November 8th, tentatively, and we are doing screenings across North America all throughout October.
Right.
And there are some screenings in the UK and in Ireland, Australia, I think one in New Zealand, and that's going to trickle out throughout the end of the year.
Right.
And we're also working on some bonus features because we have so much footage that didn't make the cut. Obviously, we have like stacks and like drives on drives on drives. We have like drawers of drives. And so we want to continue building kind of, little sequences. So it's part of an ongoing thing, and you guys can find us on ThinkSpot. They've been very supportive of us and very hands-off. It's just a platform for us to kind of release content and to continue the conversation. So we're going to be releasing content throughout the
following few months.
Yeah, and maybe into the new year.
Right.
And our website is riseofjordanpetersonfilm.com.
There you go.
Right. And all social media handles are at Holding Space Films.
Yeah.
Instagram, Twitter, all of them?
One of them is Hold Space.
Hold Space Film, somebody else took it, or Hold Space Films
which
on
one?
on Twitter.
On Twitter.
Instagram is Holding Space Films, and
Okay.
Facebook is Holding Space Films.
Right. Okay. I will attach all of that in the show notes as well. But thank you so much for doing this.
Thank
I
you.
hope
Thank you,
guys
this
had
was
something.
great.
Thank you, right on.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
Okay.
Cool.
Awesome. It was really
That was a
good
good
talking
combo,
to you
yeah.
guys.
It was fun.
Yeah.